So for the last, I don't know, 200 years or so, the global church has basically built this massive portion of its strategy for overseas missions on a single word in the book of Matthew.
Right, just one word.
Yeah, one word. But what if we've been misreading that word the entire time?
Well, that's a terrifying thought for a lot of people.
It really is. I mean, what if the grammatical foundation of the whole modern missionary movement is, fundamentally misunderstood, and the actual biblical mandate is just something far more profound and, honestly, a lot more intimidating?
We are definitely going to dismantle a few assumptions today.
Really are. So think back to growing up, right? Walking into those old, creaky church fellowship halls for the annual missionary convention.
Oh, yeah, the classic convention.
Yeah, and even before the smell of the potluck casseroles hits you, you'd see those massive sweeping banners.
The calligraphy ones.
Exactly, the really intense, glowing Gothic calligraphy strung up right across the sanctuary walls. And they always featured these commanding, totally isolated texts like, go ye into all the world and preach the gospel to every creature.
Right, or whom shall we send? Here am I, send me.
Yes, exactly. And, those banners do a lot of psychological heavy lifting for a young person sitting in the pews.
They absolutely do. They imprint a very specific theology of what mission actually is. You look at them, and the paradigm is just set.
It sets the baseline.
Right. It teaches you that the Bible is this giant book of normal religious stuff, but buried inside it are these specific highlighted commands to go do this highly specialized, extreme elite activity called missions.
Yeah, so you approach the text looking for the quote-unquote biblical basis for missions. You scan the pages for the marching orders,
Looking for those old proof texts.
Exactly, those proof texts that justify sending a family across the ocean. But when you step into the world of biblical theology and historical reality, you suddenly realize those Gothic banners might actually have the entire equation backward.
Which is exactly what we're going to get into.
It is. So welcome to this deep dive. Whether you are a pastor prepping for your Sunday sermon, a ministry leader trying to figure out how to engage a shifting community, or maybe a first-year MDiv student just trying to, keep your head above water in your hermeneutics class.
We've all been there.
We really have. Well, we are diving into the deep end today. Our mission here is to bridge biblical exegesis with historical narrative and in the process rethink the very foundation of Christian mission.
And we have some incredible source material for this.
We do. We are pulling from two phenomenal sources today. Christopher J.H. Wright's monumental theological work, The Mission of God, specifically looking at his opening chapters, and Ruth A. Tucker's biographical history of missions, From Jerusalem to Irian Jaya.
The goal here is a total paradigm shift. We really want to move away from looking for a biblical basis for missions, and instead discover the missional basis of the Bible.
I love that phrasing. It flips it completely.
Right, because when you study the first few centuries of the early church, theology was never born in an ivory tower. It just wasn't.
No, it wasn't a bunch of wealthy academics sitting around in a climate-controlled room debating abstract concepts.
Exactly. Christian theology was born out of the gritty, desperate, absolute necessity of mission. The early Christians were trying to figure out how to explain a crucified Jewish carpenter to a Greco-Roman world that found the idea entirely absurd.
It was scandalous to them.
Completely. And in that crucible of cross-cultural engagement, the New Testament was forged.
So the Bible isn't just a repository of proof texts you pull out of your pocket to, fundraise for a summer trip.
Yeah.
The Bible is the product of and the ultimate authority for the missio, the mission of God. God is fundamentally a sending God. He's a God with a mission to redeem his creation, and the scriptures are the grand unfolding narrative of him accomplishing that reality.
That is the core of it.
So I want to pose a question to you, the listener, right out of the gate. If mission isn't just a subdepartment of things the church does.
Like a line item on the annual budget.
Exactly. If it isn't just a line item, but the very reason the church exists at all, how does that change the way you read your Bible tomorrow morning?
Well, it requires a massive hermeneutical shift.
Okay, unpack that.
Well, hermeneutics, for anyone who hasn't hit that class yet, is just the science and art of how we interpret the Bible. And the traditional way we've handled missions in our interpretation, what Christopher Wright calls the proof texting method, it's deeply flawed.
Because we're just mining for verses.
Right. When we use the Bible as a mine to just dig into and extract these little missionary gems, we are bringing our own modern preconceptions directly to the text. We already know we want to do missions.
Yeah, we have the budget for it. We have the agencies already set up.
Exactly. So we just flip through the pages,
Yeah.
looking for the verses that validate the program we're already running.
It's a completely circular process.
Hmm.
And the danger is that we miss the canonical, multi-perspective reality of Scripture. You miss the forest because you're busy chopping down a single tree to build your own theological soapbox.
That's a great way to put it.
It introduces a theological mechanism here that is just absolutely vital. It's the concept of indicative before imperative.
This is huge.
It really is. So in grammar, the imperative is the command, right? The go, the do, the stop. The indicative is the statement of reality, like the sky is blue, or the war is over, or God is king.
Right. It's just stating what is true.
Exactly. And in our modern missionary zeal, we have become so obsessed with the imperative that we completely ignore the indicative. We ignore the reality of who God is and what he has already done, which is actually the engine that drives the command in the first place.
We can actually see the historical consequences of this by looking at William Carey.
Oh, Carey is such a perfect example for this.
He really is. Carey is widely considered the father of modern Protestant missions. In the late 18th century, he was a bivocational pastor and a cobbler making shoes in England.
Making shoes and dreaming of the world.
Right, he literally had a map of the world in his cobbler shop. But he lived in this theological environment dominated by hyper-Calvinism. The prevailing thought among the established church leaders of his day was that if God, in his absolute sovereignty, wanted to save the heathen overseas, he would do it completely without human help.
There's that famous historical anecdote, right?
Yeah, though it might be slightly embellished, but the story goes that a senior minister tells a young Carey, "Sit down, young man. When God pleases to convert the heathen, he will do it without your help or mine."
Just absolutely paralyzing theology. Carey was weeping over the lost, and the church machinery around him was totally frozen by this distorted view of sovereignty.
Exactly. So to break through that paralysis, Carey revolutionized modern missions by building his entire theological case on a single text, Matthew 28, the Great Commission.
The famous text.
Right. He published this incredibly influential pamphlet arguing fiercely that the command to go and make disciples had not lapsed with the original 12 apostles. It wasn't a localized historical event. It was a binding, ongoing imperative for the church in his current day.
He essentially used that single text as a battering ram to break down the hyper-Calvinist walls.
Yes. And historically, Carey's method triumphed. It launched the modern missionary movement. Thousands of people packed their lives into literal coffins and sailed across the world because of his exegesis.
Which is incredible. But as a biblical theologian looking back at this through Wright's lens, we have to examine the fragility of Carey's approach.
Because it's a lot of weight on one verse.
Exactly. Carey essentially put all of his theological eggs into one textual basket. He built a global movement on the grammatical assumption that go is this supreme military command. But what happens when we actually look at the original Greek of Matthew 28?
The grammar gets a bit complicated here.
It does, but it's so important. The word we translate as go, porithentes, is not the primary imperative verb in that sentence. It is a participle of attendant circumstance.
Okay, let's break that down for the listener who hasn't studied Greek syntax. What does a participle of attendant circumstance actually function like in a sentence?
Basically, it's an egg-in word that borrows its commanding force from the main verb of the sentence. So a better translation of the Greek wouldn't be a barking military order like go. It would be something closer to having gone or as you were going.
Right, it assumes the motion.
Exactly. The only actual grammatical imperative, the only true command in the Great Commission is make disciples.
The implication there is massive because if Carey's single basket breaks, if the go isn't the primary isolated military order we thought it was, does the whole theology of mission just collapse?
That's the danger.
If you build your entire understanding of global outreach on a misread verb, you are on incredibly fragile ground.
Right, because if your entire theology of mission is based on a military-style command, you run out of fuel the exact moment the going gets tough.
Yeah, guilt and duty only carry you so far.
Exactly. Wright-Riss argues we need to move away from this military concept of authority, where God is just a cosmic general barking arbitrary orders to be blindly obeyed by the troops. We need to move to an understanding of authority as reality.
Authority as reality. I like that.
Yeah, it means God is rendering the true underlying nature of of the universe.
Yeah.
The Great Commission doesn't actually start with a command. It starts with an indicative statement of reality.
Yeah.
Jesus says, all authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me.
Which is a staggering statement of cosmic reality.
It really is. The subsequent instruction to make disciples is entirely embedded in the reality of Christ's cosmic authority.
That changes the psychological posture of the missionary entirely.
Oh.
You aren't just following an arbitrary order against the grain of the universe.
No, not at all.
You are aligning yourself with the fundamental reality of how the universe is now structured.
I always use the analogy of gravity for this. The law of gravity isn't a military command,
Right.
The universe doesn't have a giant speaker system shouting, thou shalt fall at 9.8 meters per second squared.
That would be terrifying.
Right. Gravity is simply the reality of how mass interacts with space-time. Missional authority works the exact same way. When Jesus says he has all authority, he is stating the new gravitational pull of the cosmos.
Wow. Yeah, that's a powerful way to frame it.
Our mission is simply living in accordance with that gravity. We evangelize not because we are forced to by a harsh mandate, but because Jesus actually is the Lord of the world, and it is the most natural thing in the universe to declare reality.
Think about how a pastor's preaching changes when they grasp this shift from imperative to indicative.
It changes everything.
It really does. You stop preaching mission as a guilt trip. You stop treating it as a special program for the elite super Christians in the congregation who are brave enough to fly to dangerous places. Instead, you start preaching the entire biblical grand narrative as a unified story of God's redemptive mission.
From the very beginning.
Right, from the creation of the cosmos, to the calling of Abraham to bless the nations, to the Exodus liberation, to the incarnation, to the new creation.
So every sermon basically becomes a missional sermon because the whole book is a missional document. You aren't extracting gems anymore. You are inviting your congregation into the sweeping canvas of the missio Dei.
And this canonical reality-based understanding of mission wasn't just a modern theological realization by Christopher Wright. This was the exact operating system of the early apostles.
Oh, absolutely.
The rapid, explosive expansion of the early church through the Roman Empire in the first century wasn't just a happy historical accident. The early Christians were operating out of this deeply rooted missional reality. They knew Jesus was Lord, and they simply walked out into the world to announce it.
But, their spiritual zeal met a very specific physical world. The theology hit the pavement of the Greco-Roman context, and that intersection is where the historical mechanisms of the missio Dei become absolutely fascinating.
They really do. The landscape of the first century Roman Empire was uniquely primed for the spread of a global message, perhaps more so than any prior moment in human history.
The timing was perfect.
It was. First, you had the Pax Romana, the Roman peace. For the first time in antiquity, the entire Mediterranean basin, from Spain in the west to Syria in the east, from Britain in the north to Egypt in the south, was under a single, relatively stable political authority.
Which changed everything about travel.
Completely. This meant the seas, which were previously terrorized by competing naval factions and pirates, were cleared by the Roman Navy. The borders were heavily garrisoned. You could travel across the known world without constantly crossing hostile, warring borders.
It was an era of unprecedented, albeit enforced, stability.
Second, you had the physical infrastructure.
Yeah.
The famous Roman roads. We often picture these as, quaint cobblestone paths, but they were marvels of engineering.
They were basically ancient highways.
Right. They were deep-trenched, multi-layered highways paved with stone, built primarily for the rapid, unimpeded movement of the Roman legions and military supply chains. They cut straight through mountains and over massive viaducts.
The empire built a vascular system to enforce military dominance, and the early Christians essentially co-opted that exact infrastructure as superhighways for itinerant evangelists. They used the empire's own roads to subvert the empire's theology.
It's brilliant. Third, long before a Christian missionary ever arrived in a major city, the groundwork had been laid by the Jewish diaspora. You had a network of synagogues scattered throughout every major urban center in the empire.
And those were crucial launch pads.
Absolutely. These synagogues were filled with Jewish believers and Gentile God-fearers, pagans, who were attracted to Jewish morality and monotheism, but hadn't fully converted. This meant there was already a localized community in place that understood monotheism, that revered the Hebrew Scriptures, and that harbored a deep prophetic hope for a Messiah.
The synagogues acted as ready-made incubation chambers for the early gospel message.
And tying all of this together, the peace, the roads, the synagogues, was the linguistic landscape. Because of Alexander the Great's massive military conquests centuries earlier, the Greek language had blanketed the eastern Mediterranean.
But it wasn't the high classical Greek of Homer or the philosophers.
No, it was the common trade language. And we really need to emphasize the pronunciation here because it's a bit of a shibboleth in theological circles.
Oh yeah, we definitely need to get this right. It is Koine Greek, pronounced Koinai Greek.
Exactly, koinai. It literally means common. It was the language of the marketplace, the docks, the soldiers, and the slaves. This koinai Greek allowed a missionary, like the Apostle Paul, to travel from Jerusalem up through modern-day Turkey, over to Greece, and all the way to the capital in Rome, and preach in the public squares without ever needing to hire a translator.
That is wild to think about.
The linguistic barrier that plagues modern missions simply did not exist in the same way for the apostles.
So you have the Pax Romana, the stone highways, the synagogue network, and the universal Koinai Greek. The chessboard is perfectly set, but having a good board doesn't mean you win the game. You still need a strategy.
And Paul had a brilliant one.
He did. This is where the Apostle Paul provides a masterclass in theological, cross-cultural contextualization. Wright spends a lot of time analyzing Paul's incredibly nuanced, multi-tiered approach to pagan idolatry.
It's a fascinating contrast.
It really is. If you read Paul's pastoral and theological writings, addressed internally to Christian believers, take Romans chapter 1, for example, he is absolutely devastating. He doesn't mince words. He describes idolatry as a wrath-inducing rebellion.
He's very clear on the theology of it.
Extremely clear. It is a deliberate intellectual suppression of the truth of the Creator in favor of worshiping creation, and he argues that this fundamental theological swap leads directly to moral decay, sexual brokenness, and societal collapse. He pulls zero punches when explaining the theology of idolatry to the church.
Look at the mechanism of Paul's actual evangelistic preaching to pagan audiences in the book of Acts. His tone, his entry point, and his methodology shift dramatically based on the specific audience he's addressing.
Let's look at some examples of that.
Okay, let's look at Acts chapter 14 and the rural pagan city of Lystra. Paul and Barnabas heal a crippled man, and the local crowds immediately assume they are the Greek gods, Hermes and Zeus in human form.
Which, by the way, has a bit of historical humor to it. They assume Paul is Hermes, the messenger god, simply because Paul is the one who won't stop talking.
Right. The crowd actually brings out bowls and wreaths to offer blood sacrifices to them. Now, how does Paul react? He doesn't drop Romans 1 on them. He doesn't scream that they are reprobate rebels destined for the wrath of God.
He meets them where they are.
He does. He tears his clothes in distress, yes, but his verbal appeal is entirely based on the natural world. He emphasizes God's gentle providence. He tells them about the living God who sends rain from heaven, who gives them crops in their seasons, and who provides them with plenty of food and fills their hearts with joy. He starts with the universal human experience of agricultural blessing to point them to the Creator.
That's brilliant contextualization for a rural audience. Then you turn a few pages to Acts 17, and Paul is in Athens. He is no longer dealing with rural farmers. He is standing before the intellectual, philosophical elite at the Areopagus, the Stoics, and the Epicureans.
A completely different crowd.
Exactly. So his strategy shifts again. He doesn't start by calling their statues demonic. He stands up and says, "People of Athens, I see that in every way you are very religious." He finds a point of cultural contact, the altar to an unknown god.
He even quotes their own people.
Yeah, he quotes their own pagan philosophers and poets like Epimenides and Aratus to establish common ground about humanity's relationship to the divine before pivoting to the resurrection of Jesus.
And the most striking example of this nuance is in Acts 19, in the massive metropolis of Ephesus. Ephesus was the center of the cult of Artemis, a colossal economic and religious powerhouse. A riot is sparked by the local silversmiths who realize Paul's preaching is hurting their idol-making business.
Hit them in the wallet, right?
Always. The entire city is in an uproar in the theater. And the city clerk, a pagan official trying to quell the riot, actually stands up and defends Paul and his companions. The clerk publicly states, "These men have neither robbed temples nor blasphemed our goddess."
Just let that sink in for a second. Paul had been preaching in the province of Asia for over 2 years. He had been so effective that the idol industry was facing a recession. Yet his preaching had been so carefully contextualized, so focused on the positive reality of Jesus rather than just mocking the local deities, that a pagan official could accurately testify that Paul had never actively blasphemed Artemis.
It's astounding restraint.
It is. He didn't wage a culture war of insults against the local goddess. He simply preached a better king.
The methodology adapts to the context, while the core message of the Missio Dei remains immovable.
It makes me think about an analogy to describe this duality. I've sometimes wondered, is Paul acting like a spiritual diplomat in the book of Acts, but a battlefield general in the book of Romans?
I like that.
Because when he's interacting with the pagan world, he's negotiating, finding common ground, building cultural bridges, being diplomatic. But when he is writing internally to the church, he puts on the general stars and says, make no mistake, this is a life or death cosmic war against spiritual darkness.
The diplomat versus general framework is helpful, but we have to be careful with the word diplomat because it often implies a position of high status, earthly power, or untouchable privilege. A Roman diplomat traveled with guards and imperial backing.
Right, and Paul definitely didn't have that.
No, his historical reality was the exact opposite. He practiced a sociological mechanism that historians call downward mobility. Remember Paul's background. He was a highly educated Pharisee, trained under Gamaliel. He held Roman citizenship, which was an incredibly rare and valuable legal status.
He had all the pedigree to be a major power broker.
He could have easily climbed the highest rungs of the Judeo-Roman social and political ladder, but he deliberately stepped down the social ladder to reach a wider, more marginalized audience. To support his missionary journeys, he worked with his own hands in the dirty, sweaty trade of leatherworking and tent-making.
Which was not highly respected work.
Not at all. He associated freely with slaves, women, and the lower classes. He abandoned the prestige of his rabbinic pedigree to become a wandering artisan.
Which completely contradicts the triumphalist church growth models we see so often in modern Western ministry. Today, the strategy is often to target the affluent influencers, the wealthy business owners, the local politicians, the celebrities, with the idea that if we win the top of the social pyramid, the influence will trickle down and legitimize the church.
Yeah, the trickle-down gospel.
Exactly. But Paul did the exact inverse. He started in the dirt.
And this downward mobility was accompanied by a staggering amount of physical and emotional suffering. Paul's life was defined by a theology of failure, at least as the world measures success.
We really sanitize his story, don't we?
We do. We look at the maps in the back of our Bibles with those neat little arrows showing his missionary journeys, and we assume it was a narrative of unmitigated, glorious triumph. But the physical reality was brutal. He was beaten with rods by Roman lictors. He was pelted with stones and dragged out of the city left for dead. He suffered through multiple horrific shipwrecks in the Mediterranean. He carried deep physical scars on his body.
We also completely gloss over the severe emotional and relational trauma. Think of the rupture with Barnabas.
That one is heartbreaking.
It is. Barnabas was his mentor, the man who vouched for Paul when the rest of the church was terrified of him. They were best friends and ministry partners. Yet they had a disagreement over John Mark that was so sharp, so bitter, that they permanently parted ways.
The historical reality of mission is incredibly messy. It's not the sanitized, smiling version of missions we print on prayer cards. But that is the theological linchpin. This suffering, this very failure in the eyes of the Roman world, authenticated the Missio Dei far more powerfully than visible success ever could.
Because it subverted their entire value system.
Exactly. The Greco-Roman world worshipped strength, power, and physical perfection. Paul presented a gospel of a crucified God delivered by a scarred, beaten, shipwrecked tent maker. His physical weakness became the undeniable conduit for divine power.
If we follow that thread of suffering to its logical conclusion, Paul's ultimate earthly failure was his execution. He was beheaded under the Emperor Nero in Rome. But that execution set the stage for what would become the most powerful, paradigm-shifting missiological tool of the next 2 centuries of the early church.
The era of martyria.
Yes.
The word martyr in Greek literally translates to witness. As the apostolic era closed, the church transitioned from relying primarily on verbal apologetics, arguing the intellectual merits of the faith, to relying on the ultimate nonverbal witness, the willing sacrifice of their own lives.
The ultimate proof of their reality.
The Roman state began to crack down on the rapidly growing Christian movement, not constantly, but in vicious, intermittent waves of persecution. And this witness was not done in secret. It was violently forced into the public spectacle of the Roman arena. To understand the mechanism of how martyrdom functioned as mission, we have to look closely at specific biographical accounts, like Polycarp of Smyrna and Perpetua of Carthage.
The details of these accounts strip away all our modern, comfortable notions of what it means to stand for your faith. Let's start with Polycarp. The historical context of his martyrdom provides a massive theological lesson on the nature of authority.
Polycarp was the bishop of Smyrna, a city in modern-day Turkey. By the middle of the 2nd century, he was an old man in his 80s. More importantly, he was a living, breathing link to the apostolic age. Historical records indicate he had been a direct disciple of the Apostle John.
Wow.
Around the year 155 AD, local pagan authorities targeted him. Now, it's crucial to understand the political dynamics here. The high-ranking Roman officials didn't actually want to hunt down and kill a beloved octogenarian. It was terrible optics. But the local crowds, whipped up by a frenzy during the public games, were demanding the blood of the Christian leader.
So the mob essentially forces the hand of the state.
Exactly. Polycarp initially followed the advice of his friends and went into hiding at a small farm outside the city. He spent his time doing what he always did, praying for the churches. But under severe torture, a young servant boy eventually broke and revealed Polycarp's location to the authorities.
That must have been devastating.
When the armed soldiers arrived at the farmhouse late in the evening, they found Polycarp resting in an upper room. He could have tried to flee further, but he simply said, "God's will be done." He came downstairs, and rather than resisting, he actually ordered his own friends to serve a lavish meal of food and drink to the soldiers who had come to arrest him.
He hosts a dinner party for his executioner.
Yes. His only request was that they give him an hour to pray uninterrupted.
The pastoral grace required to look at the men holding the swords and offer them hospitality is just staggering.
The soldiers are actually ashamed of their mission after seeing his demeanor, but they still bind him and bring him into the city, straight into the roaring stadium. The Roman proconsul looks at this frail, venerable old man, and the political reality sets in. The proconsul doesn't want to execute him, so he practically pleads with Polycarp to find a loophole.
He's looking for any way out.
Right. He says, "Have respect for your age, swear by the genius of Caesar, repent, and say, 'Away with the atheists.'"
Let's clarify that term because it sounds really strange to modern ears. To the Romans, the Christians were the atheists.
Right.
The Greco-Roman world was flooded with visible gods, statues, and temples. Because the Christians refused to participate in the civic cult and worshipped an invisible god without statues, the Romans accused them of being godless atheists.
So the proconsul is trying to give Polycarp a political out. Just say the words. Just play the game. Appease the mob. So Polycarp looks out at the bloodthirsty pagan crowd in the stadium, solemnly waves his hand toward them, looks up to heaven and says, "Away with the atheists."
He completely flips the script on the proconsul, identifying the pagan mob as the true atheists.
It's so bold. The proconsul becomes desperate. He presses him further. "Take the oath, and I will let you go. Revile Christ." This is where Polycarp delivers one of the most famous declarations in Christian history. He looks at the magistrate and says, "For 86 years I have been his servant, and he has never done me wrong. How can I blaspheme my king who saved me?"
Such a powerful moment.
Realizing he cannot break the old man, the proconsul orders him to be burned at the stake.
We have to unpack the theological mechanics of what is happening in this exchange. This wasn't just a stubborn old man refusing to compromise on a personal religious preference. This was a cosmic, political, and theological collision between two absolute claims to reality.
Two competing claims of lordship.
Exactly. You had Kyrios Isos, the reality that Jesus is Lord, colliding head-on with Kyrios Caesar, the imperial demand that Caesar is Lord. Why did the proconsul care so much about a pinch of incense? Because the sprawling, diverse Roman Empire was held together sociologically and politically by the glue of the imperial cult. The worship of the emperor's genius was the unifying loyalty oath of the ancient world.
If the Roman state could force a prominent, revered Christian bishop to offer a pinch of incense to Caesar, it would validate their imperial theology. It would prove that, at the end of the day, Caesar's authority was supreme and Jesus was just a secondary localized deity.
By refusing to say the words, Polycarp wasn't just defending his personal faith. He was publicly declaring that Caesar was a subordinate, temporary authority. He was enacting the indicative reality of Christ's cosmic kingship right in the face of Roman military power.
And the Romans firmly believed that throwing Christians to the wild beasts or burning them alive would terrorize the populace into submission. They viewed the arena as a mechanism of ultimate control.
But it didn't work.
Not at all. The public spectacle completely backfired. The North African apologist Tertullian famously observed this phenomenon, writing, "The blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church." But it's important to understand why it was the seed. It wasn't just an inspiring emotional display. It was an active theological dismantling of the pagan power structures.
The crowds watched these Christians die not with a desperate terror of criminals, but with serenity, forgiveness, and absolute unflinching conviction.
It exposed the profound moral bankruptcy of the Roman pantheon and the impotence of the Roman state. The Romans could crush bone and burn flesh, but they could not conquer the soul or force the conscience. The arena proved that the Christian God was stronger than Roman death.
If you want to talk about exposing the impotence of the Roman state, the story of Polycarp is powerful, but the Diary of Perpetua is just absolutely earth-shattering.
We move forward in time and across the Mediterranean to North Africa, specifically the city of Carthage, in the year 202 AD. The Emperor Septimius Severus had issued an edict forbidding conversions to Christianity. Vibia Perpetua was caught in this dragnet. She was a 22-year-old noblewoman.
Just 22.
Yes, highly educated, married, and a nursing mother of an infant son. She was arrested alongside several others while she was still a catechumen, meaning she hadn't even been baptized yet. She was just undergoing basic instruction in the faith.
Wow, she was brand new to it.
What makes Perpetua's narrative so historically unique and incredibly powerful is that we aren't just reading a later account written by a historian. We have her actual prison diary. We have her own words written in the dark, sweltering dungeon.
It is arguably one of the most harrowing, deeply personal documents to survive from antiquity.
The primary agonizing conflict detailed in her diary isn't actually her theological debates with the Roman guards or the governor. The core conflict is with her own pagan father.
That dynamic is so intense.
He loves her desperately. As a Roman paterfamilias, he is used to absolute authority over his household, but he is reduced to begging. He comes to the prison repeatedly to try and break her resolve. He kisses her hands, throws himself in the dirt at her feet, and pleads with her, crying out, "Do not cut us off entirely, for not one of us will ever hold up his head again if anything happens to you."
The emotional manipulation is completely weaponized by the state. At one point during her public hearing, the Roman governor, Hilarianus, actually orders her aged father to be thrown to the ground and beaten with a rod right in front of her eyes. The governor hopes the sight of her father's humiliation will break her.
Perpetua writes in her diary that she grieved for her father's plight, feeling the blows as if she had been struck herself. She pities him, but she will not yield.
The absolute emotional climax of her diary occurs when her father brings her infant son to her in the prison. He holds out her baby and says, "Be merciful to us, daughter, and live with us. Perform the sacrifice." The historical account details that she pushed the baby away, essentially saying, "Be gone from me, enemies of God."
That is a tough passage to read.
It really is. Now, as a theologian, I have read this text with seminary students, and they almost universally recoil at this moment. We have to address the friction here. How does Perpetua pushing her nursing infant away reconcile with the theology of Christian love and family? Isn't that an unnatural, almost fanatical abandonment of her most basic biological human duty?
It is a deeply jarring, uncomfortable moment for modern readers who hold the nuclear family as the ultimate societal good. But we have to understand the sociological mechanisms of the Roman world and the brutal reality of an exclusivist faith confronting a totalitarian regime. In the Roman patriarchal system, the paterfamilias had absolute, legal life and death authority over the family. The family was the foundational unit of the state religion.
So it wasn't just a private family matter.
No, by demanding she recant for the sake of the family, her father was demanding that her ultimate, supreme allegiance belonged to him and to the state, not to God.
She recognized the trap.
If she gave in to her father's emotional manipulation, even for the sake of her child, she was publicly declaring that earthly ties supersedes the lordship of Christ. Jesus himself laid down this severe reality when he said, "Anyone who loves father or mother, son or daughter more than me is not worthy of me." Perpetua wasn't a fanatic who hated her child. She was living out the agonizing, literal reality of those words.
Her supreme allegiance to God redefined the boundaries of all earthly ties.
Right.
She entrusted her baby to the care of her mother and the local Christian community, believing that her ultimate faithfulness to God, even to the point of death, was the truest act of love she could offer, far more important than securing a few more years of physical life by committing idolatry.
And her death in the arena stands as a testament to that total surrender. She and her slave girl, Felicitas, who had actually just given birth while in the prison, were stripped, placed in nets, and sent into the arena to face a mad, wild heifer.
Just horrific.
After being violently tossed and gored by the animal, Perpetua's tunic was torn. The crowd was roaring, But Perpetua's focus was entirely elsewhere. She calmly drew her torn tunic over herself to maintain her modesty. Then, realizing her hair had come undone, she asked for a pin to tie it back up. In the Roman world, disheveled hair was a sign of mourning, and she refused to mourn on the day she believed she was going to her glory.
The poise in the face of absolute savagery is almost incomprehensible.
Finally, the surviving Christians were lined up to be dispatched by the gladiators. The gladiator assigned to Perpetua was young, inexperienced, and visibly trembling. His first sword thrust missed the fatal mark and struck her on the collarbone. She cried out in pain, but then, seeing the young man's hesitation, she reached up, took the gladiator's trembling hand, and physically guided his sword to her own throat.
She literally had to help her executioner kill her. She was in absolute control of her own martyrdom to the very last breath.
The Roman state didn't take her life. She surrendered it as a supreme witness to the missio Dei.
The blood of Polycarp and Perpetua purified the church. It drew a stark, undeniable line in the sand between the kingdom of God and the kingdom of the world. But historical mechanisms shift. What happens when the dynamic fundamentally changes?
Everything turns upside down.
What happens when the persecution stops? The Emperor Constantine converts in the early 4th century, and Christianity transitions from being a persecuted minority to the official, comfortable, and eventually mandated religion of the Roman Empire.
That political shift changes the entire trajectory of mission. When the church and the state become closely allied, Christianity becomes socially advantageous. It becomes the fashion. The churches in the civilized urban centers are suddenly flooded with nominal believers who are seeking political prestige, economic connections, or social standing rather than carrying a cross.
The motivation completely changes.
The radical, costly evangelistic fervor of the early centuries begins to cool in places like Rome, Carthage, and Alexandria. So the geographical center of mission has to adapt. It shifts from the Mediterranean urban centers out to the wild, barbarian fringes beyond the fortified borders of the Roman Empire.
We move to the frontier, and this brings us to some of the most fascinating, unconventional characters in the history of missions. Because the strategy has to evolve. You are no longer debating Stoic philosophers in Athens or defying Roman proconsuls in Carthage. You are engaging with nomadic, warlike tribes deep in the dark forests of Europe. Let's look at the mechanisms of frontier mission, starting with Ulphilas.
Ulphilas was a prominent 4th century missionary to the Goths, the sprawling barbarian tribes living north of the Danube River, in the regions of present-day Romania and Bulgaria. To understand Ulphilas, we have to look at the complex theological currents of his time.
And as an historian, you have to help us navigate this carefully because Ulphilas was consecrated as an Arian bishop. We need to be completely impartial here and look at this simply as a historical reality of Byzantine theology at the time.
Right, we're not taking theological sides here.
No, just reporting it. Arianism was a massive theological movement stemming from the teachings of a presbyter named Arius in Alexandria. Arius was trying to preserve absolute mathematical monotheism. To do so, he argued that the Son of God was essentially different from God the Father, that Christ was the firstborn of creation, begotten in time, and therefore not co-eternal or of the exact same divine substance as the Father.
Which sparked the Council of Nicaea.
Exactly. It sparked massive debates. We are just reporting the historical reality that Arianism was a deeply influential, wildly popular stream of theology in the Eastern Empire for decades, and Ulphilas was a product of that theological stream.
Regardless of how his Christology aligned with the final definitions of Nicaea, his missiological zeal and his technological contributions to mission were undeniable. Ulphilas spent 40 years living deeply embedded among the Gothic tribes, evangelizing them. But his monumental crowning historical achievement was linguistic.
It's an incredible story.
He realized that to truly plant the church, the Goths needed the scriptures in their own tongue. The problem was, the Goths were pre-literate. They didn't have a written language. They had spoken words, but no alphabet to record them.
Think about the sheer mechanical difficulty of that task. How do you translate a complex theological Greek text for a culture that has never written down a single word?
Ulphilas did something astonishing. He listened to the phonetic sounds of the Gothic language, and using his knowledge of Greek and Latin characters, he invented the Gothic alphabet from scratch.
He literally invented their alphabet.
Yes. He mapped the spoken barbarian tongue to physical symbols and then proceeded to translate the Bible from Greek into this newly invented Gothic language.
It is a technological marvel for mission. It's the ancient precursor to the modern translation work of organizations like Wycliffe Bible Translators. But this incredible linguistic achievement brings up a very sharp, controversial hermeneutical question. According to historical tradition, Ulfilas translated the vast majority of the Bible, but he purposefully omitted the books of Samuel and Kings.
His reasoning was highly pragmatic. The Goths were already a fiercely violent, martial culture devoted to warfare and raiding. Ulfilas reasoned that they didn't need to read the violent military exploits, the conquests, and the bloodshed of ancient Israel, lest the biblical texts spur them on to more tribal warfare under a religious guise.
I have to ask the theological question here. Was this an act of brilliant pastoral contextualization? Was Ulfilas just being an incredibly astute missionary, recognizing the specific sociological weaknesses of his target culture and protecting them from stumbling blocks? Or was it a dangerous editorial truncation of the canonical missio Dei?
It's a tough question.
Do we, as messengers, have the right to permanently edit and censor God's word because we assume a culture can't handle it?
It remains a profound ethical and missiological dilemma. On one hand, you have to applaud his deep cultural awareness. He knew his audience intimately and wanted to shape a peaceful Christian community. But on the other hand, a canonical hermeneutic, like the one Christopher Wright argues for, insists that the whole Bible is the necessary story of God's mission.
You can't just pick and choose.
Right. By removing the books of Samuel and Kings, you don't just remove battles, you remove the entire theology of Davidic kingship. You remove the prophetic critiques of abusive power. You remove the complex, messy realities of how God's people interact with hostile political structures. You run the terrible risk of creating a sanitized, truncated faith that lacks the theological depth to handle political reality.
But regardless of the controversy, Ulfilas' translated Bible gave the Goths an identity, a literacy, and a faith that they carried with them as they eventually migrated and conquered their way across Europe.
While Ulfilas was working with the Goths in the east, there was another massive tectonic shift happening further west, transitioning us into the era of the monastic sending models.
Right, as the Roman Empire slowly collapsed and Europe descended into the so-called Dark Ages.
Exactly. We see a stark contrast develop in how mission was executed. On the European continent, you had the Roman institutional mission. This model was highly centralized, hierarchical, and often directly tied to state power, relying on the conversion of kings to mandate the conversion of the populace.
Very top-down.
But out on the absolute fringes of the known world, in the British Isles, a totally different mechanism evolved. The wild, decentralized, fiery Celtic monastic movement. And the towering, legendary figure here is Patrick.
I love discussing Patrick because almost everything popular culture tells us about him is historically inaccurate.
Oh, completely.
He wasn't Irish, he wasn't Roman Catholic, and he certainly didn't chase literal snakes out of Ireland, considering the island never had an indigenous snake population due to the Ice Age.
The historical reality of Patrick is far more compelling than the myths. Patrick was actually born in Roman Britain, somewhere near the end of the 4th century, into a relatively comfortable Christian family. His father was a deacon and a minor Roman official. But when Patrick was a teenager, roughly 16 years old, his life was shattered.
Kidnapped, right.
Yes, he was kidnapped by violent Irish raiders, dragged across the sea, and sold into slavery in the harsh, pagan wilderness of Ireland, where he was put to work as a pig herder.
The psychological trauma of that event is immense. Imagine being a civilized, culturally Roman teenager, ripped from your family, stripped of your clothes and your dignity, and plunged into forced labor in the freezing rain and snow of the Irish mountains.
But it was precisely in that trauma, in the brutal isolation of tending pigs on the mountainside, that his nominal inherited faith became a visceral reality. Patrick writes in his Confession, which is a phenomenal, authentic historical document, that the love and fear of God grew in him immensely during his slavery.
It's amazing how suffering strips away the superficial.
He writes that he would pray up to 100 times a day, and nearly as many times in the night, out in the woods and on the mountains, regardless of the snow, frost, or rain. The wilderness forged his theology. After 6 grueling years, he received what he believed was a divine prompting in a dream, telling him his ship was ready.
He escapes.
He miraculously escapes, walking nearly 200 miles to the coast, talking his way onto a pagan pirate ship, and eventually making his way back to his family in Britain.
He survived the trauma, he escaped the wilderness, but then the unthinkable happens. After settling back into a comfortable life and studying for the ministry, he has another vision. In a dream, he sees a man coming from Ireland with countless letters, and he hears the voice of the Irish people crying out, "We beg you, holy youth, to come and walk among us once more."
A literal callback to his captors.
Yes, he receives a calling to return to the very people who had kidnapped, abused, and enslaved him. He goes back to Ireland as a missionary.
And his missiological approach was entirely different from the Roman institutional model of power. He didn't arrive with military backing, royal decrees, or diplomatic pomp. He arrived with the profound moral authority of a former slave who had forgiven his captors.
That moral authority is untouchable.
He understood the culture, the language, and the harsh realities of the Irish tribal system intimately. He didn't try to enforce Roman diocesan structures. Instead, he established monastic communities that fit the tribal nature of the Irish. He openly debated the powerful Druids, challenging their spiritual authority not with state power, but with spiritual demonstration. He ignited a grassroots movement that profoundly transformed the island.
That Celtic monastic movement didn't just stay isolated in Ireland. It became an explosive engine for foreign missions. It birthed a passion to keep pushing the frontiers. You have subsequent figures like Columba, an Irish monk who left his homeland in the 6th century and established a monastery on the tiny, barren, windswept island of Iona off the western coast of Scotland.
Iona is such a critical place in this history.
It became a massive spiritual training center. From that tiny island, these Celtic monks, known as the Peregrini, or wandering exiles for Christ, poured out across Scotland, down into England, and eventually pushed deep back into the European continent. They were decentralized, radically passionate, and committed to spreading the gospel through establishing localized communities of intense prayer, scholarship, and agricultural labor.
If we take all of these historical mechanisms and theological concepts, Wright's theology of the Missio Dei, Carey's battle with hyper-Calvinism and grammar, Paul's nuanced contextualization, the ultimate witness of the martyrs, Ulfilas's linguistic inventions, and Patrick's trauma-forged authority, how do we synthesize this?
That's the million-dollar question.
If you are a listener right now, an MDiv student trying to frame your theology, a pastor writing a sermon, or a ministry leader navigating a complex neighborhood, what does this mean for you on Monday morning?
It means we have to radically recalibrate how we operate. Let's start with preaching and hermeneutics. If the entire Bible is the narrative canvas of God's mission, we have to learn how to preach the Old Testament missiologically, not just as a series of moral fables. Take the Exodus, for example.
Great example.
In many evangelical circles, we often spiritualize the Exodus simply as a neat metaphor for personal salvation from the slavery of sin. But Wright forcefully argues that the Exodus is the biblical prototype for holistic mission. When God intervened in Egypt, he didn't just offer the Israelites internal spiritual forgiveness, he physically liberated them from brutal political, economic, and social oppression. The Missio Dei addressed their bodies and their sociopolitical reality just as much as their souls.
Which speaks directly to one of the most toxic divisions in the modern church. We see this massive, unhelpful bifurcation between evangelism on one side and social justice on the other, as if they are competing departments in a corporation.
Wright issues a severe warning against using the phrase secondary mission. He talks about missionaries out in the field doing vital medical work, drilling wells, or teaching agriculture, who are subtly or sometimes overtly told by their supporting churches back home that they are only doing secondary mission.
That's so damaging.
The implication is that the real missionaries are the ones doing exclusively verbal evangelistic preaching. Wright says that is a biblically deficient view. Mission belongs to God, not to our neat categories. And God is concerned with the redemption, restoration, and healing of the entire creation, spiritual, physical, social, and ecological. When a pastor preaches, they must hold up both the demand for personal spiritual repentance and the demand for systemic physical justice. To sever the two is to truncate the Missio Dei.
Moving beyond the pulpit, there is the intense challenge of cultural engagement and leadership. We are living in an increasingly post-Christian, postmodern, heavily pluralistic society. In many ways, our modern cultural landscape feels much more like the first-century Greco-Roman world than the Christianized culture of the 1950s.
I completely agree with that assessment.
If the early church succeeded because it offered a radical, countercultural community of love, fidelity, and sacrifice, in the midst of Roman pluralism? How should a modern pastor navigate our current context?
I think we have to return to Paul's Ephesus strategy in Acts 19. Paul practiced uncompromising evangelism. He clearly proclaimed the indicative reality that there is only one God and that Jesus is Lord, but he did it in a way that actively avoided unnecessarily blaspheming or mocking the surrounding culture's idols.
Right, he didn't pick fights just to pick fights.
He wasn't out in the streets of Ephesus kicking over the shrines of Artemis or screaming insults at the silversmiths. He spent his time building an alternative, compelling community in the lecture hall of Tyrannus. The community of the church was so vibrant, so full of grace and truth, that people voluntarily walked away from the idols. As ministry leaders today, we do not need to wage an angry culture war of insults against the secular idols of our day. We need to preach the gospel with absolute clarity and simultaneously build communities of such profound, sacrificial grace that the cultural idols simply lose their appeal by comparison.
That requires a significant, painful shift in how we measure success in ministry. The modern church is heavily addicted to corporate metrics. Weekend attendance, budget surpluses, square footage of buildings, social media reach. But look at the history we've just covered.
It is a devastating critique of our modern metrics.
If Paul's apostolic ministry was authenticated by a theology of failure, by physical scars, shipwrecks, riots, and relational heartache, and if Patrick's profound spiritual authority came precisely from his time as a trauma victim and a marginalized slave in the wilderness, how should modern pastors view their own seasons of wilderness?
That is a piercing question.
When Sunday attendance is low, when the church budget is painfully tight, when you feel culturally marginalized, irrelevant, or outright opposed by your community, the immense temptation is to abandon the slow work of the missio Dei and reach for pragmatic corporate church growth gimmicks. But history tells us that the wilderness is not a sign of God's absence. The wilderness is often the exact forge where God creates true missional authority.
That is a deeply comforting yet terrifying thought. The wilderness is the forge. To bring the theological vision of Christopher Wright and the gritty historical reality of Ruth Tucker into a final unified thesis for our listeners. Mission is not a program the church runs. It is not a line item on the annual budget. It is not a 2-week trip the youth group takes in the summer to build a house.
It's bigger than all of that.
Mission is the very identity of the church participating in the life of God. God is a sending God. He sent the Son into the incarnation. He sent the Spirit at Pentecost. And together, the triune God sends the church into the world. If you read the Bible missiologically, realizing that it is the story of this grand sending, it changes absolutely everything. It changes how you prepare your sermon on Thursday, how you treat your unchurched neighbor on Friday, and how you view your own suffering and apparent failures on Saturday.
It integrates every single aspect of life under the cosmic indicative authority of Christ.
It truly does. Thank you all for joining us on this deep dive. It's been an incredible journey exploring texts, crossing centuries, and examining the lives of those who carried the message before us. But before we sign off, we want to leave you with a lingering question, something for you to wrestle with as you step back into your specific ministry context this week.
Think back to the early centuries we discussed. The Roman Empire demanded a pinch of incense and the words, "Caesar is Lord." It was a subtle but deadly test of allegiance. And out on the frontier, the Goths required an entirely new, invented alphabet just to comprehend the basic concepts of the gospel because their culture had no categories for it.
So as you look at your own community, your own city, your own neighborhood this week, what is the unwritten language of your specific context? What are the subtle cultural nuances, the hidden pain points, and the unique vocabularies you need to learn before you can even begin to speak the gospel effectively? And perhaps more chillingly, what are the modern imperial cults your congregation is, quietly, perhaps unknowingly being asked to bow to every single week in our culture? Where are they being pressured to offer a pinch of incense to a lesser god? How will you translate the reality of the Missio Dei for them tomorrow?
May you have the theological wisdom of Paul, the unflinching courage of Perpetua, and the pastoral grace of Patrick as you find out.
We'll see you next time on The Deep Dive. Keep reading, keep learning, and keep participating in the mission.